Welcome, everybody. I'm really glad that you could take an evening with us. I'm Lee Rinehart with National Center for Appropriate Technology. I'm an agriculture specialist here based out of the Northeast region, and I'm with Justin Morris, who's an NCAT regenerative grazing specialist based out of Idaho. And both Justin and I work with that ATTRA with NCAT on the ATTRA program, ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture, as well as the NCAT Soil for Water project. And those will be referenced now and again throughout this presentation and the next sessions that come. But I just kind of wanted to introduce ourselves. And Carlos is working from his office in Arkansas to make sure that this all works properly. He's the behind the scenes person, the tech guy, because heaven knows Justin and I don't know much about it. So thank you, Carlos, for making this happen. We really appreciate it. We're going to just kind of give a few more minutes to see if we can allow some more people to come in, and then we're going to get started. We do want to try to maintain our schedule today, but we do want to make sure that everybody can participate. So thank you for joining us. And Justin, did you have any first words that you would like to say?
Just that we're both really excited to share this information with all of you, and looking forward to having some good discussions in chat and answering people's questions and journeying down this road together. Absolutely.
One of the things that we know whenever we have sessions like this, whether they're online like this one or whether they're in person, is there's an awful lot of knowledge in the audience. We're a community, and we hope to have the opportunity to allow people to ask questions and comments throughout these presentations so that we can make it as much of a conversation as we can. We do have content we'd like to present, but we'd also like to offer ways for feedback and clarification. We'll do our best to answer all the questions and comments as they arise. So basically, here we are. Again, this is the first in our four-part series of advanced grazing for regenerating soils and advancing animal nutrition. And we wanted to kind of, Justin and I wanted to do kind of a deep dive and really, take our experience and the experience of a lot of our fellow colleagues and farmers and ranchers and grazers and practitioners, and just kind of put it out there and start a conversation and kind of dig deep into what is it that really sets well-managed grazing apart for building soil and for being profitable and feeding our animals. So that's kind of the whole idea with this four-part series. Carlos, can you advance to our next slide? So just a few little housekeeping items. I wonder if Carlos, you would go ahead and put up the poll. We do have just a short 3-question poll just to get a little idea of who's in the audience. Feel free to fill out that poll. And I think there's like 3 questions there. And that would just kind of give us an idea of who's in the audience and who we're talking to, who we're engaging with. So thanks for doing that. Feel free to enter any questions or comments you have in the chat. We will have NCAT specialists monitoring that chat, answering any questions that they can, or keeping questions for the presenter, whether it's myself or Justin, to answer at the end of his session tonight. So we'll try to get all of those answered. Feel free to put questions in the chat box. And William Bryan, cattle, sheep, and broiler chickens. Great, welcome, William. Our next sessions, I want to draw your attention. This is the first in a series of 4. The next session will be on May 12th, another one on May 26th, and then another one on June 9th. And we invite you to attend any or all of those that you can. One last thing is we will have an evaluation at the end of this session, and we like to invite participants to fill those out if they can, because it really gives us a lot of good feedback on, the topics we covered, helps us to improve on where we need to improve and see where we really hit the mark. So we appreciate any feedback you might give on those evaluations. So with that, we'll just kind of go into the agenda. Justin and I will be sharing this today. I will start off talking about, just kind of setting the stage in this 4-part series with just a basic overview of soil health principles, and some basic grazing dynamics and ecosystem processes. Followed by, the concepts of events that we do on the land that really have compounding effects over time, whether positive or negative. We'll talk about diversity, and we'll talk about ecosystem disruption and how that fits into ecosystem generation, repair, regeneration, and such. And then Justin will come in and he will talk about basically soil aggregation and the science, the biochemistry behind soil aggregation formation, and how it contributes to water quality and capture through that stable soil system that it generates. And finally, he will finish off talking about some grazing management styles, and that'll pretty much set our stage. And then we'll continue on in 2 weeks talking about plant density and recovery and disturbance, paddock size, all the way down through the 26th, and then the June 9th, finishing up with adaptive management and grazing regimes. So welcome, and we'll go ahead and get started. Carlos, next slide, please. So here we are. We're going to start off with a kind of an overview of the 5 soil health principles. We're going to lay a foundation here for this session and the next 3 sessions to come, by beginning with what we think is the foundation of agriculture, and that's soil health. Justin's going to go into a lot deeper into this topic later, so we'll just review the 5 principles to set the stage for what's to come. First off, there's optimizing disturbance, right? Disturbance is one of our principles that we use to maintain healthy soils and to build healthy soil ecosystems. It's good to know that disturbance is natural to ecosystems. These can come in the form of grazing or fire or flooding or plant disease or even drought. And it's important also to know that it's disturbance is what is stimulating change on the landscape. And this comes through plant recovery. And the direction of the successional change that we see on the landscape is impacted by the frequency and the intensity and the duration of the disturbance that's experienced. But what we want to do is we want to manage our lands to optimize the disturbance to obtain certain ecological benefits without causing harm. Things like appropriate plant defoliation, like whether it's grazing or mowing or whatever, right? Hoof action on the soils that helps to break crusts and to trample plant matter into the soil. Clipping pastures, doing controlled burns, minimizing tillage, that type of stuff. We need to optimize. We need to think about optimizing this disturbance and not reducing nor maximizing. No disturbance is harmful to the soil ecosystem when plants are not grazed periodically, right? We need disturbance. When there's no disturbance, the leaves aren't replaced and the photosynthetic capacity is reduced and the sugar supply to the microbes is reduced as well. And when the soil life aren't being fed, then you're going to have a reduction in soil aggregation. So that's disturbance. Next is to optimize biodiversity. We know that plants harvest sunlight and atmospheric CO2, and they make carbon liquids that are exuded from the plant's roots, and they feed a complex soil microbial community. Christine Jones, and many of you might know of Christine Jones from Australia, soil scientist, she describes how this happens through the liquid carbon pathway. Here, the plant exudates contribute about 30% of the plant carbon straight into the soil, and this directly feeds soil microbes. And here's why diversity is so important. Plant polycultures, having lots of different plants out there more efficiently harvest the sunlight and the carbon dioxide, and they extract nutrients from various depths within the soil profile. And in addition, various plants, the diversity of plants we have are all associated with different beneficial soil microorganisms, such as nitrogen fixers and fungi. So what are some of the ways that you can increase diversity on your land? Well, it really depends upon your goals and your resources, including your time, because there's a lot of ways to do it out there, and there's no one right way. It has to be done based upon what your goals are and what resources you have. Otherwise, you can just get in a bind. Some of the things that you could do would be to include high density grazing for short periods to optimize disturbance. You could do frost seeding, grazing, multi-species, cover crops, and many other things as well. The sessions in this series that we're going to be having in the next 4 weeks or so will cover many of the ways to add diversity. So next, we're going to talk about optimizing soil cover. This is incredibly crucial to the welfare of soil microorganisms because it's their habitat, right? It's their home. Justin said one time is like, you wouldn't treat your hand, the way that we treat the soil sometimes, right? Think about it as part of our body, right? I wouldn't put my hand in a bucket of 2,4-D. I wouldn't cut off my hand or run a disc plow over it. And when I was having a conversation with Justin, that kind of really hit home for me. It's their home, it's their habitat. Soil cover reduces soil water evaporation and it keeps the moisture available for plant use. It tends to stabilize soil temperature, very importantly, and makes soil warmer in the cold weather and cooler in the hot weather. Having soil cover reduces compaction, breaks up compacted soil. It suppresses weed germination. It's a protective habitat for the soil food web surface dwellers as well. So when you keep soil covered, you protect your soil with green and growing plants, followed by their residues. And residue management is really optimal too here. We want just enough residue on the soil so that the soil organisms that are there can digest it in enough time before the next grazing season happens. So that brings up a question. Can you ever have too much soil cover? And I think you can. You can have too much, just as with a pasture that's been rested too long or has never been grazed. You get a buildup of a thatch layer and it signifies poor nutrient cycling. And then that the system just isn't working. You might have seen residue on the ground that turns gray and oxidizes instead of going through the biochemical degradation of that nice brown color. That's really what you want. So too much cover can be a bad thing, just like no cover at all. Again, the point here is optimize soil cover. Grazing animals are a tool for managing this soil cover. And as with disturbance and biodiversity, we're looking for that optimal type. So next, we're going to talk about living roots throughout the year. Keeping those roots in the ground where they belong all year provides diverse perennial grasslands with plants that can grow most months of the year. These can include like cool season grasses, warm season grasses, legumes, flowering forbs, cover crops, stockpiled forages, all kinds, whatever you can do to keep those living roots going, because maintaining continual live plant roots in the soil harvests that carbon dioxide from the air and the sunlight, and it feeds those soil microbes for as many of the months of the year as possible, giving them those carbon-based root exudates and keeping them going. And so this in turn stimulates microorganisms to build more soil aggregates and pore spaces. And those pore spaces are critical for catching inorganic nutrients and keeping those out of our streams and creeks. And importantly, it provides food and habitat for beneficial pollinators and wildlife. So finally, our last principle in this overview is to integrate livestock. The whole reason why we're here. Livestock on the pastures drastically increases the rate of nutrient cycling, and it maintains the diversity of those pasture plants. So how does this happen? Well, basically, grazing animals stimulate soil biology through their hoof action, through their dung, their urine, their saliva, which really kind of stimulates plant growth. And also from the microbes on their hair coat. They're putting biology into the soil just by their presence of being there. In addition, the short periods of grazing followed by long recovery periods with proper stocking allows forage plants to regrow and to really harvest that additional sunlight and carbon dioxide and keep that cycle going. Also, well-managed fall or winter grazing safeguards fall grass tillers and helps convert standing dry plant residue into beneficial soil organic material. Having pasture, you know, in addition to all of these ecological benefits that we get from them, reduces our dependence on confined feeding, you know, reducing water quality and nutrient management concerns, allows livestock to graze, and makes a lot more economic sense, I think, compared to hauling feed to a feedlot, right? Having animals on the land efficiently recycles most nutrients, all those minerals and vitamins and carbon back to the land where it belongs, and reduces the energy needed to collect, haul, and spread manure, things like that, or feed or anything. So, and importantly, properly managed grazing animals can manage weeds, right? They can manage weeds without herbicides and turn them into a feed. Basically turning a problem into a profit, which is something that we're going to cover on the next session. I think it's on the 26th. During session 2 of the series, we'll go into turning weeds into feed. So Carlos, let's go ahead and hit the next slide. So having reviewed these 5 soil health principles, let's get grounded in the ecological processes that are impacted, both positively and negatively, by livestock grazing. In essence, the selection pressure by ruminants on the plant ecosystems results in successional changes in plant communities. That is, changes in the landscape over time. Grasslands evolved with wild-hoofed animals and are adapted to periodic disturbance, notably grazing and fire. And so it's that type of disturbance that we want to optimize, right? We want to imitate that, as we'll see later. So let's take a deeper look at plant succession now. Next slide, please, Carlos. So this is our successional chart here when we're talking about ecosystem processes. Richard Teague is a retired professor of rangeland ecology at Texas A&M, and some of you may know him or know of him. But he has stated that grazing tends to maintain the landscape in a perennial grassland sterile stage. I think that third stage that I can see there, let me increase my screen and see it. Yeah, that third, the grassland perennial upper end of the pioneer species on our chart, because of the interaction of fluctuating conditions on the landscape. These conditions can be climate or fire and grazing, and result in a resilient and a really dynamic network of organisms that respond to periodic disturbance. That's the whole point, is that you've got this dynamic organic system here that has evolved to respond to periodic disturbance. And we try to manage that disturbance as agricultural producers. But it's important to know that ecosystems never really reach a steady state or a climax sterile stage because of the management that we are putting and inputting into the system. Everything is in flux. There's natural and optimal disturbances that rejuvenate and transform grasslands continually. Changes in succession that you might see include those to soil structure and to nutrients and nutrient cycling and plant species composition and the structure of those plants and even the biodiversity levels. All these things can change based upon how we put into this input of disturbance into the land. But management can move that succession in the direction of whatever desired change we want, up and down. Whatever we do can move it up and down that successional chart. And this is done through altering the frequency and the intensity and the extent and the magnitude of the impact that we put on the landscape. Optimal disturbance through grazing, and this is important to know, keeps grasslands productive with higher nutritional content than ungrazed meadows and rangeland. So go to the next slide, please. So what's happening on the landscape by ruminants that causes successional change? So in this book, this is a book I had in college, and Steve Archer and Fred Smeens write in this text on grazing management and ecological perspective, note that there are direct and indirect effects of grazing on soil and plant communities. Grazing alters the age structure of leaves and the total leaf area of plants, resulting in some direct effects of grazing on the landscape. And these include things like compensatory photosynthesis after defoliation, because the plants need to catch up, right? So you've got a compensatory photosynthesis with nutrients being partitioned just for that purpose. You have a reallocation of carbon to leaves after defoliation to fuel new leaf growth. You have a short-term reduction in root growth at this time and a reduction in size. And this is resulting in carbon residue for microbes. So they're going to start to chewing up all of this carbon residue. Reduction in sugar reserves within the culm and the leaves for about 3 days before the plant starts to kick in photosynthesis again. So you got to think about that. There's a reduction in those sugar reserves for about 3 days before photosynthesis starts in. So that's important for determining the length of your grazing period and your recovering period, realizing that it takes time for the system to kick back in once more, right? You've got a reduction in axillary buds until the carbon reserves are increased. You got water and transpiration rates that vary after defoliation, and tillering of the plants could be impacted, where defoliation during stem elongation may reduce tillering in some species of grasses. So this is really important for considering the seasonal timing of grazing and how tall you're going to be grazing certain species. And there's a post-grazing competitive advantage of some species of others. We know this, that whenever weeds come in, sometimes we see competitive advantage of some species over others. And all these direct effects combine to encourage population changes in the plant community. But grazing also has some indirect effects on plant communities, including the alteration of the energy flows, right, through the decomposition pathway underground. You've got root growth stoppage, you've got variation in plant root exudates then. So you've got this alteration of the energy flow. You've got impacts of nutrient fate and use by different plants and microbes. All of these things are in flux because of this one grazing event. And you've got a modification of the microclimate, such as the elimination of a plant canopy through grazing that can increase the soil temperature and increase evaporation. And you have a disruption of plant competitive interactions can result in population changes as the cereal stage shifts up or down the successional continuum. And again, this is why weeds can come in sometimes in some systems as they just take advantage of open slots. As Justin's going to talk about later, these processes are important to determine what grazing systems and regimes we're going to employ. And I'm really kind of looking forward to his presentation on that. One system, though, of promise is adaptive management. According to Teague, the A&M researcher, adaptive multipaddock grazing strategies have been designed basically to imitate the ecosystem processes we've been talking about. And this is because ecosystems have evolved in response to intense periodic grazing and defoliation and disturbance by large herds of hoofed animals, right? So, having this as an option is really good because it's been documented that this type of adaptive multipaddock grazing can be effective in even reversing the damage that has been caused by continuous grazing over time, which is really, really promising. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so it's important to note as we talk about being flexible here, right, in making our grazing decisions. It's important to note that no system is going to maximize animal productivity and all ecological services the same. That's why we're talking about optimization, right? In fact, instead of maximizing productivity and function, it's better to achieve optimum appropriate levels of stocking at the right time and at the right intensity so that we can allow the regeneration of the pasture while maintaining an acceptable level of animal productivity. One of the things we can do, though, is we can see cost reductions through reducing inputs. This input reduction through reliance on these ecosystem services that we get from the land, from improved soil health, nutrient partitioning and cycling and this and that, is one way to maintain animal productivity by increasing the net income we have through the operation by reducing costs. So grazing through adaptive management. So what exactly does that mean with respect to flexibility, right? Well, I think it means having flexibility again, and I've said this before, there's going to be a lot of redundancy here because some of these principles I think are just really important. And I know if you're like me, the more you hear it, the more it sinks in. But by having flexibility in the timing, intensity, and the duration and the frequency of that grazing service we have, we can have an impact. And that's what it means to be adaptive. And we do this depending upon the seasonality of the pasture, where it is throughout the grazing season, its maturity, the moisture levels, the animal type, and then your time and your management resources as well. Being flexible means managing animal impact and the recovery periods in various ways over time. So what does flexibility look like? Well, let's look at an example. Let's say you want to renovate an old field that has become less diverse over time. So maybe due to overgrazing or no grazing at all, or perhaps it's an old field that was cropped and left fallow for decades. We all know of fields like this. A field, let's consider a field in the southeast or the northeast that may easily move from, say, perennial grasses and forbs to tall plants like broom sedge and ragweed if grazed continuously or cropped and left alone for years. What could you do with this field, right? How could the animals help this kind of land without mowing it or spraying it or doing something like that or reseeding it, right? How can the animals help? Well, I've seen a dairy producer in Pennsylvania, and I've seen much more, but he comes to mind. He leaves a field that needs to be renovated alone to grow tall all season, right? And then he puts dry cows on it at a very high density for short durations. And they're going to find the good stuff because there's going to be good stuff under the weeds and under all of the old material. They're going to pick something out, and they're going to trample the rest into the soil to provide soil cover, right? And to provide that carbon for soil microorganisms. Several of these kinds of treatments can allow biomass to accumulate and return all that carbon back to feed the soil microbes, and it'll reconstitute the soil food web. That's the important thing. Get it primed again, resulting in an increased diversity and higher palatability plants over the years. It takes a couple of years to do this sometimes, but what you get is a really resilient, healthy pasture that is self-reliant. This is just one way to use planned acute disruption in your favor, which we'll talk about a little bit deeper here in a minute. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I know some of you may know of Alan Williams with Understanding Ag LLC. He said one time, there's nothing that we do in agriculture that has a singular effect. As a matter of fact, most of the things we do in agriculture have an exponential effect. We often simply don't realize it. Again, this is a part of his concept of adaptive management, right? Really kind of having an adaptive mindset. The principle of compounding effects here is his first of 3 principles that define adaptive grazing management. The others being the principle of diversity and of disruption. And so we're going to start with the compounding effects right now. The cascade of effects of our management can be either negative or they can be positive, right? So think of tillage. What are the positive and negative compounding effects of this kind of event, right? Well, the positive effects may be weed control for a season, right? It could be seed preparation for seed to soil contact. We can think of many other positive effects, right? And so what are the negative cascading effects over time? Well, this must be maintained year after year with lots of energy for one thing, right? So that's a cascading effect. And we know that tillage results in decreased soil carbon. It has negative effects on microbial populations, causes decreased soil structure, and the effects go on and it multiplies throughout the years. Next slide, please. So the same happens with grazing, all right? Continuous grazing causes a series of effects that can spiral downward. Let's say that we have a pasture that's overgrazed, right? It's severely overgrazed and we have the over removal of desirable plants. So we start there. Then that causes a decrease in root mass, which results in a reduction in nutrient cycling because the the microbes have nothing to feed on. Then we have resultant soil infertility, which results in a reduction in water holding capacity through reduced soil aggregation. And then we finally find ourselves at the end of the spiral with lowered forage yield and reduced animal productivity. So we have to start bringing supplemental feed in, right? So these are all aspects of Allen's principle of compounding effects. You can see how one effect just compounds and goes deeper and deeper, but it can go the other way too, right? Good grazing management that is observational and adapts to the situation on hand and focuses on building healthy soil has cascading positive events that will benefit the farm, the livestock, and the farmer for years. So let's go to the next slide. So our next principle is that of diversity, right? Plant species diversity and complexity across the landscape will have positive compounding effects over time. Think of a meadow of various grasses. Okay, you've got grasses, you've got forbs, you've got shrubs, and they're all occupying the same community over time and space, right? With perennials and annuals and cool and warm season plants alike. This diverse population occupies all the niches above and below ground, from short-rooted depths like bluegrass, something like that, or annual weeds, to greater depths of 10 to 12 feet or more for native warm season perennial grasses. In this situation, there's a habitat for a full spectrum of soil microbes to do their work, right? And the plants, in turn, offer subsistence to the microbes through their root exudates. So diversity is not merely having a lot of species in the paddock or in the pasture, though. What we want to manage for is both species richness and species diversity. So when a population expresses species richness, that means that there's many plant species represented throughout the pasture. But not only do we want richness or many species doing their good work, we also want each species to have many individuals represented in the population. And this is species diversity. So let's go to the next slide and talk about that. So here's an example. On the left is table 1. This is pasture 1 on our example. It's characterized by 6 species. What do we have here? We have milkweed, pigweed, ryegrass, foxtail, clover, and orchard grass. Okay, so that's what we got in both pastures. Pasture 1 is characterized by these species. So we'll say that this pasture has a species richness of 6. Orchard grass dominates and in plant numbers, and the other species have fewer individuals within the mix. So now let's look at the one on the right. So this is pasture 2. Here we have the same species richness as pasture 1. We have a species richness of 6, but species 2 has more species evenness, with each species having a more even number of individuals represented in the population. Both pastures have the same number of species and the same number of individuals, but pasture 2 has more species diversity due to more species evenness. And this is going to become important when we think about how these plants interact with soil microbes in order to really build soil and build soil aggregates. And what's more, diverse families of plants, for instance, members represented from legumes, from brassicas, from sunflowers, from grasses, is a one-up on diversity from plant species alone, because some microorganisms are singularly associated with specific families as well as with species. For example, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So, they're known to be associated with many species of legumes and grasses, but not brassicas. And this is because the bractices have glucosinolates that can be hydrolyzed in the soil to release toxic products to some soil fungi. And that's why some plants, just do not associate, right, with some certain microorganisms. So what we're shooting for here is a diversity of plant families, of species, and individual plants. Factors such as soil fertility and climate and herbivory, disturbance, and microbes all contribute to this plant diversity. So our grazing management impacts all these factors using high animal density for short periods of time with full recovery of the plants, combined with all those biological inputs from the animals, will encourage more of this kind of diversity. And it will have positive compounding effects on the soil health and on the productivity. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So let's dig even deeper into diversity. What's going on in the soils biochemically as a result of the diversity in these agroecosystems? Why is it that everybody is always harping on about diversity? Well, here's why I think they are. One of my favorite soil scientists is Christine Jones. She's a soil scientist from Australia, provides some pretty sound principles based on empirical observation. She says, every plant exudes its own unique blend of sugars, enzymes, phenols, amino acids, nucleic acids, auxins, gibberellins, other biological compounds, many of which act as signals to soil microbes. Root exudates vary continuously over time. And depending upon the plant's immediate requirements, you know, is how they're going to, is how much exudates they're going to put out. The greater the diversity of the plants that are out there, the greater diversity of microbes that we have, and the more robust the soil ecosystem is. In fact, plant production is often higher in diverse plant communities. And this is what's really cool. Diversity has been reported to influence forage yield to a greater extent than fertilizer does. In a study on the effects of nitrogen applied at rates of 0, 100, and 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year to 78 experimental grassland communities, each of increasing plant species richness found that high plant diversity with 0 fertilizer produced better yields than a low diversity pasture with 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare applied per year. And that's pretty important. It's often assumed that nitrogen comes only from fertilizer or legumes, but that's not so. We know that all green plants are capable and associated with nitrogen fixing microbes. It's not just legumes, right? We have bacteria and archaea. Archaea are similar to, but they're not really technically the same as bacteria, but archaea are actually thought to be one of the most prominent converters of ammonium to nitrate, which makes nitrogen into a form that's available for plant uptake. So there's lots of different nitrogen fixers out there, and having a diversity of green plants in the soil year round allows those soils to develop their own ability to fix that atmospheric nitrogen. However, what's important to know is that if high rates of nitrogen fertilizer have been used for a long time, you got to wean off slowly, right? You can't. I read an article about I think it was India. I may have the wrong country, but it just came out today. They banned the use of synthetic fertilizers and tried to go organic in 1 year, and they crashed because you've got to wean yourself off of this stuff, right? You have to wean them off, as those free living nitrogen fixing bacteria require time to reestablish. So Jones outlines a path to reducing this chemical nitrogen use of chemical commercial nitrogen in pastures over a 5-year period. She recommends that we take a 20% reduction the first year, followed by 2 years of an additional 30%, culminating with 2 years of minimal applications of around 4 to 5 pounds per acre per year, right? Reducing yourself slowly because you're building up that community of nitrogen fixing bacteria that are going to take over that duty. Once again, here I'm going to refer to Richard Teague. He says, when artificial inputs like inorganic fertilizers and pesticides and livestock medications are used, or when grazing practices don't encourage adequate regrowth and ground cover, the soil organisms are impaired and the ecological functions they perform are diminished. And then we have the delivery of those ecosystem services that we need are reduced. So let's go ahead and switch to this next slide. This is my last slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Justin. So lastly, let's finish up with disturbance, with disruption, okay? As we've seen, disturbance is a natural aspect of grassland ecosystems, right? We're just trying to mimic it. It can come in the form of drought or fire, hail, insect pests, flooding, or grazing, whatever. And it is, in a sense, has been the way that Mother Nature has managed plant succession. And while nature does it unreflectively and ecosystems bounce back depending upon the intensity of that disturbance, we can use the disturbance to send or keep plant succession in the sterile stage that we find advantageous, right? But it's important to know, not all disturbance is created equal. Whether a disturbance is good or bad depends on the timing and the frequency and the duration and the intensity of that disturbance. For instance, let's think about this, when the timing of disturbance is variable and when it's of short duration and is of low frequency so that plants can fully recover, and is of moderate to high intensity, the disturbance can be positive and can result in improved plant and soil health. But when the disturbance has little variation in timing and is of long duration, like you keep the animals on a paddock for too long, right? And of high frequency, like you're returning to that pasture too soon, right? That plants can't fully recover, and is of either a low sustained intensity or even especially high intensity, the disturbance can result in a degraded soil and degraded plant community. So well-managed grazing is an example of the first or the acute disturbance, and overgrazing is an example of the second or chronic disturbance. So what do we do when we use disturbance? What are some of the things that a grazer would do to be adaptive in purposely disturbing the ecosystem to gain the advantages that she or he wants? Well, as I think about it, one could vary how and when the animals move around the farm through the rotation, right? You could lengthen the season, lengthen the grazing period, and the rest periods during a drought, let's say. Or if one needed, you could get the animals off of a paddock sooner to allow them to trample residue into the soil, because that's something that you think you want to do for that as a treatment to renovate that soil. Or you could alternate skipping paddocks every season to allow for nesting bird habitat, right? Think of the compounding effects that each of these practices would have on the land, right? That's what we're talking about here, is thinking and imagining what would happen is a part of the adaptive mindset that will broaden our knowledge of the land as it's put into practice. We're going to cover this a little bit deeper in session 4 when we go into adaptive management. So I'll just kind of leave that there. But having set the stage here in our first session by discussing these soil health principles and these grazing dynamics, I think we're set now to take a deep dive with Justin into soil aggregate formation and what a healthy soil actually is. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Justin.
All right. Thanks, Lee. You can hear me all right.
You bet.
Well, thank you for sharing everything that you did. You're a tough act to follow, I got to say. You shared some excellent information with all of us, and we're all learning new things as a result of your efforts. In going into the second part of the presentation, we kind of wanted to set the stage here for talking a little bit about how what Lee was talking about with adaptive management and about the soil health principles, and talk a little bit about what soil health is and how we can improve it over time. And so with that, as you see in front of you on this slide, is a definition of soil health. Now, pretty much everybody by now, I'm guessing all of you have heard the phrase soil health before. You really just can't hardly open up an ag publication or go online and read anything ag related online without coming across this phrase of soil health. But one of the definitions that has really resonated with me for a number of years has been this one, which is the continued capacity for a soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that enhances the well-being of plants, animals, and humans. And I've underlined and italicized some of those words because I want to take a little bit of time with all of you in picking apart what what some key aspects are, some key words in this definition that I think make the definition of soil health come more alive. So the first one here is the phrase continued capacity. And what that's really referring to is the soil's ability to provide its various functions, including producing food for us, to meet not just the demands of the present, but also demands for the future. There's been several projections out there saying that, by the year 2050, we're going to be feeding around 9 billion people on planet Earth. And so as we move into the future, and this is my personal belief, is that agriculture is going to have to really focus for the next 25 years or a little bit more, is going to have to really focus on soil health-based solutions. This isn't going to be something that we're going to be able to engineer our way out of, but it's something that we're going to have to really take more of a soil health-centric focus on. The next word that I wanted to cover here was the word function in that definition. And that word function at least implies to me, or it begs the question, is what is soil supposed to do? Well, there's several things soil is supposed to do. If we're going to give soil a job description, it should infiltrate water. It should hold water for plant growth. It should provide gas exchange, meaning that it should allow air to go into it and allow carbon dioxide to go out. It should also provide an optimum growing environment for plants, right? Because we're using livestock to harvest the energy that's in those plants. So we need that optimum environment for plant growth. The other thing too is that we need our soil to be able to weather the catastrophic events that we seem to be seeing more and more of. Whether we're talking about really extreme droughts, whether we're talking about flood events, the soil, if it is truly healthy and functioning, can help to mitigate a lot of that and basically be like a shock absorber to the different things that are happening in our environment. And it needs to provide nutrients for our plants, which then can be conferred and transferred to the animals that are grazing them. So that function is really lost when a soil can't do these things very well. And then it has to be supplemented with external sources of fertility. So essentially, the soil turns into basically like a drug addict. It becomes dependent on something that has to be provided externally. And then that places us in a position where we have to then go to town to pay for whatever it is that we're bringing onto the property to get the soil to work and get our plants to grow the way that we're wanting to grow. So really a major part of our job as graziers is to restore soil function, because if we don't, folks, who's going to do it for us? So then we come to the word vital. And to me, vital is really kind of synonymous with the word like essential. It's something that you cannot live without. It's like breathing air. You can't go very, very long without breathing air. And so treating our soil like dirt isn't an option, right? So as the soil goes, so goes civilization, so goes humanity and the health of our planet. And we need the soil to support life, but the soil needs life in the form of plants, animals, and humans to help it improve quickly. So then we come to the phrase living ecosystem. And this is something that I have to admit, when I was going through my studies a couple decades ago, this is something that really didn't come into the conversation, was that soil was actually something that was living. And there's more living organisms in a teaspoon of healthy soil than there are people on the planet, which is kind of mind-boggling to me. These organisms are working symbiotically with plants, and that's really what supports life on our whole planet. And soil without life is really, it's just dirt, right? Just plain and simple, it's just dirt. If there's no life in it, then it's just a physical chemical substance. But that physical chemical substance becomes soil when there's life in it. So life is really what makes soil soil. And as Lee had mentioned before, if we treat the soil really as if it were an extension of your own body, as if it was your hand, you don't want to go without a hand. You don't want to damage your hand. Once we start to get to the point where we look at soil as something as personable as being an extension of ourselves, then we're really, in every decision that we make, every grazing management decision, and if we're doing any cropping decision that we're doing, we're not going to want to do anything that's going to harm it. We're going to only want to do things that are going to promote the life that's in it, so that can be actually shouldering the burden of providing nutrients for our plants, rather than us having to go off the farm, off the ranch to bring fertility in. The word enhances, to me, really kind of confers the meaning of going from a lower state to a higher state of health or performance. So the word that used to be here in this definition was the word sustain. And as I was going through this and helping to create this presentation with Lee, the word sustain to me wasn't going to the point that I wanted it to go. And I figure, for soil, when we're talking about soil health, we want something that is enhancing function, is enhancing our own lives, enhancing the well-being of animals. And when we say sustains, a lot of times that, to me, that just kind of means, well, we're sustaining life, but is life really thriving? And I want life to thrive. And to me, that word enhance really kind of takes it to that next level. And so that really means, we've got the potential to improve beyond just merely surviving, beyond just sustenance. We're going to the next level. And finally, the phrase well-being. This is a word here, or phrase, that really encompasses all dimensions of life, including nutrition. So when plant and animal well-being are enhanced through healthy soil, then really our own well-being through the nutrition we receive from them should also be enhanced. And plants grown in a healthy soil really have that potential to provide the necessary vitamins, minerals, the medicinal compounds that improve our well-being beyond just merely calories and protein. Next slide, please, Carlos. So soil aggregation is really the foundation here. And for those of you, the word aggregate may be a new term, especially when it comes to soils. But think of aggregation as like a clump or a cluster or a group that is close together. So if we take 5 or 6 of us and we all kind of cluster, into one spot of the room, you could say that we're an aggregate, right? So we're still individuals, but we're very close together. And one of the best indicators for soil health is soil aggregation. And what is it? It's really the physical, chemical, and biologically driven process that brings soil particles together to be held in a single mass or cluster, such as in a clod or a crumb. And that process drives the creation of good, crumbly soil structure that has the appearance of like cottage cheese or chocolate cake. At least the shape of it, maybe not the color. You probably don't want your soil to look like cottage cheese from a color standpoint, but what we're talking about is the structure of it, how the different soil particles are arranged. And this process drives soil health because it provides so many benefits. And the benefits, I put up here on the screen. It's basically a win-win-win. If we get good soil aggregation and the creation of good stable soil aggregates, guess what? Water infiltration improves. The plant available water improves. What's that going to do for you? Well, that means when things start to dry up, guess what? That means your plants are going to continue to grow even though the rain or the irrigation is shut off, because you've got more plant available water. Your gas exchange increases, meaning that soil is allowing oxygen an oxygen, nitrogen atmosphere to be able to come into the soil, because we have a lot of soil biology in there that need to breathe air, just like we do. They're aerobes, aerobic soil life. And then in the process of them breathing in air, they're also exhaling carbon dioxide. Well, guess what? Plants need carbon dioxide, and plants have special pores on the underside of their leaves that actually absorb that carbon dioxide that's coming out of the soil surface. So if we've got that good aggregation, that allows that gas exchange to be able to take place. And as plants get more CO2 coming out of the soil, guess what? Photosynthesis then increases. So we see that increase in plant growth. That can also facilitate the plants being able to start growing sooner in the growing season and grow later into the growing season, so that your growing season, your green season, actually starts extending on both ends, both the front and the back. And if we have that, folks, we're producing more forage, then guess what? Our input costs are going to start dropping, because now we're providing more forage. The animals are able to graze more days throughout the year. That means fewer days that they have to be on hay or some other externally brought in feed source. And what does that do for us mentally, socially? Well, it improves our well-being, right? I mean, mentally, it helps us. I mean, it can not only help us financially, that's one side of the equation, but it can also help us just through a reduced stress load, because we're not in a situation where we're spending so much money on inputs, and we're able to keep more of that money in our pockets. And that helps us psychologically, because we're able to provide more of that forage at a much lower cost. Next slide, please, Carlos. So I want to kind of take you down into kind of the level of microscopy here a little bit with this diagram. This basically kind of shows, if you're to look at soil in your hand and you're to start taking a microscope and going down deeper and deeper and deeper into it, what is it that you're going to see? So at the very smallest point, if you get high powered microscopy in there, you'll see on this diagram here above letter D, where you see primary particles of silt, clay, and humus. So, this is where you're going to see those individual soil particles. And as through chemical and physical processes, it enables those primary particles to start clustering into what are called submicroaggregates. Those submicroaggregates eventually become microaggregates. So we're going up in size as we're moving to the left on this diagram. And those microaggregates are really interesting, because it's at this level, at the microaggregate level, that soil biology really becomes absolutely essential to be able to go on to the next and final phase, which is the construction of macroaggregates. Now, whether you've got pasture or cropland, you'll have soils that, and even if it's soil that has been tilled to death or pasture that's been overgrazed, you'll have microaggregates. But where the rubber meets the road, where we really see the big change in hydrologic function, where the soil really starts becoming more of a sponge and being able to take on more water and hold out water and make it available to plants, is when we move from that microaggregate stage to the macroaggregate stage. And in order to make that shift from microaggregates to macroaggregates, guess what it takes? It takes soil life to make that happen. It does not happen via just chemical and physical reactions. It actually takes soil life. And as you can see on that microaggregate, you can see that there's roots, there's fungal hyphae, there's spores. So you've got biology that's there that's helping to enmesh and cluster those soil particles together, those submicroaggregates into microaggregates. And then in order to make that large macroaggregate, it takes biology to continue doing that. So when soil life has been greatly damaged through chronic disturbance, tillage, or overgrazing, it's the macro aggregate that is most easily destroyed. That's what ends up leaving first. So the disc overgrazing will take the micro aggregate out. It will start to disassociate back into micro aggregates. The problem is that the micro aggregate level, at that level, you do not have the absorptive capability, the infiltration capability of water like you do when you have your soil where intact macro aggregates have been created. Next slide, please, Carlos. So while scientists have known for a long time about life in the soil, that knowledge really hasn't trickled down into agriculture on a broad scale until fairly recently. I didn't come across the term soil health. I can actually dial it down to June 14th, 2010 was the first time I ever heard the phrase soil health. So, that was almost 12 years ago. And some of you might have heard that term even before that. For me in 2010, and ironically with Lee Rinehart, who I am co-presenting with, it was actually at a American Forage and Grassland Council conference in Springfield, Missouri, that I ever heard about the concept of soil health. And Lee Rinehart happened to be there as well because we knew each other from before. So whenever I see Lee, it brings me back to that exact date when I was in Missouri. But when we look at the life that is in the soil that is working in concert with grasses, legumes, forbs, shrubs, trees, anything that animals can graze. One of the most incredible relationships, folks, in nature is that relationship between roots and soil life. It sounds very simplistic, but science is just beginning to uncover the universe that is in the soil. So far, we've only identified about 2% of all the soil microorganisms in the soil. Only 2%. We know more about what's going on in the next galaxy than we know what's going on in our own soil. So I really look at this, they call space the final frontier. The soil would be like, I don't know, the infinite frontier. But it's really in that the root zone of the plant, right around the root hairs. The plant is actually releasing sugars and other organic compounds into the soil, and that's feeding the bacteria and fungi. And it's these bacteria and fungi, in return, they're accessing areas of the soil that are unreachable by the plant roots to gather the mineral nutrients that plants need. Next slide, please. So in the process of soil life, gathering the nutrients that are needed, combined with these other compounds being released by roots, the soil particles actually start to clump together. And when they start to clump together, folks, then that starts to create pore space in the soil. And that is the very genesis of soil aggregation. So that's when you're moving from that micro aggregate level to the macro aggregate level, like you saw a couple slides ago. So this is what's going to allow water to more easily infiltrate and be held in the soil for future plant use. It's going to enhance that gas exchange, like what I was talking about, that's so crucial for photosynthesis to occur. And when you look at that photo on the left, that you see like these little strands that are connecting those micro aggregates together. And those strands are actually filaments of beneficial fungi. And they're connecting those soil particles together. And that's right there, folks. That is soil aggregation in action. But again, it takes life to do this. It takes beneficial fungi, beneficial bacteria to enable this process to happen. The photo on the right shows a small root starting to colonize the soil. And you can see these little white strands that are coming out from the root that are beneficial fungi that have actually entered the root. and they're moving across the soil and increasing the nutrient absorptive capabilities of the plant. And fortunately, most of our plants are mycorrhizal fungi friendly. They want to develop that relationship with beneficial fungi. Now, if you looking at these photos, folks, look at how crumbly the structure is of the soil. It looks like like chocolate cake or like cottage cheese. When you see that nice crumbly soil texture, that's a very good indicator of a healthy soil. And believe it or not, the most important livestock that you have on your grazing operation are the ones you never paid for. And they're the ones that you rarely, if ever, seen. These are your underground livestock: the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, the nematodes, the archaea, like what Lee was talking about, all the way up to earthworms and dung beetles. Now, most of you have probably seen earthworms. Everyone's seen earthworms. Maybe some of you have or have not seen dung beetles, but this microherd is what we'll call them. They're what support your above ground herd. So your underground livestock support your above ground livestock by collaborating with the plants to promote the conversion of sunlight energy into carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and medicinal compounds that livestock and eventually all of us need to thrive. Next slide, please. So there's three main biological processes for soil aggregation. So we have the first one is burrowing and molding activities of soil animals. The second one is an enmeshment of particles by sticky networks of roots and fungi. And the third one, which is the one that I get probably the most excited about, is the production of the organic glues by microorganisms, especially bacteria and fungi. So earthworms and termites, they move soil particles around, they ingest them, they form them into pellets or casts. When you're out walking out in your pasture in the late spring, early summer, peel back the vegetation, look at the ground surface. Sometimes, you can see where residue gets piled up. We call those are called middens, and earthworms form those. They're pulling dead plant residue into their hole. And a lot of times you'll see like little round balls around their midden. Those are earthworm casts. So that's the earthworm manure. Very, very nutrient dense stuff. The other thing too is that plant roots move particles about as they push their way through the soil. And then that movement of the plant roots forces soil particles to come into close contact with each other. And that also encourages aggregation. Plant roots, they also create channels, and soil animals also create large conduits for new root growth. Plant roots, and especially root hairs and special beneficial fungi that are called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, they're releasing polysaccharides, which are sugar-like substance, as well as other organic compounds, which form sticky networks that bind together individual soil particles and tiny microaggregates into larger macroaggregates. So that's pretty exciting stuff. Also, the thread-like fungi associate with plant roots called mycorrhizae, and they produce a sticky sugar protein called glomalin. So glomalin is a cementing agent that is usually found in higher concentrations in stable rather than in unstable aggregates in soil. Fungi and bacteria receive carbohydrates, which is an energy source that they receive from plant roots to create those glue-like compounds that form stable soil aggregates. And in the absence of green growing plants, bacteria, if they don't get a food source from a plant, guess what they start to do? They actually start to digest the glomalin made by mycorrhizal fungi, and now your soil aggregates start to lose stability. So what does that mean when the soil aggregate begins to lose stability? Well, that means when that aggregate, when water covers that aggregate actually starts to fall apart. It actually starts to disassociate. And that's not a good thing. In the picture here, above letter A on the left, That's showing fungal strands that are growing over the surface of a mineral grain encrusted with microbial cells and debris. And in the middle is an advanced stage of aggregation during the formation of soil from dune sands. So some people have asked, can you actually get soil aggregation to occur on sands? Yes, you can. It often takes a lot longer to be able to get aggregation to occur on sands, but you can get it. And then on the right, we're seeing strands of fungi that are interconnecting the soil particles in a sandy loam. And I kind of look at those strands as like, you know, if you've ever driven over a suspension bridge and you see all those cables that are holding up the bridge, that are tying everything together, you know, this is like micro cables that are connecting these different micro aggregates to be able to form macro aggregates. Next slide, please. So bacteria also produce organic glues, such as polysaccharides intermixed at a very small scale with clay particles. And many of these root and microbial organic glues resist dissolution by water, and not only enhance the formation of soil aggregates, but they also help to ensure their stability over time, over a period of months to a few years. So these processes are usually the most apparent in surface soils where root and animal activities and organic accumulation are the greatest. The formation and stabilization of granular aggregates is primarily influenced by soil organic matter, because it's organic matter that provides the food source that makes biological activities possible. So during the aggregation process, silt and fine sand particles become coated and encrusted with bits of decomposed plant residues and other organic materials. So we get these organic polymers that result from the decay of plant residues that chemically interact with the particles, those silicate clays and iron and aluminum oxides. And so these compounds help to orient the clays into packets, which then form bridges between individual soil particles, which then bind them together into a water-stable aggregate. So in the photo on the left, we're looking at the same soil type. So you got the same soil type in both glass jars. In the left photo, one's the low organic matter soil, one is the high organic matter soil. Now, interestingly enough, there's only a 0.9% difference in organic matter between these two samples. So that doesn't sound like very much. And when you look at the structure of the soils, you know, they appear to be well aggregated, right? But when you expose the soils to water, and that's what we see on the right, after the soils have been wetted by pouring water on them, look at the dramatic difference that we see. So the jar on the left, the low organic matter soil, it basically turns into mud. You don't see those aggregates anymore, and it just turns into just a mud, mucky paste. Whereas the soil on the right with the high organic matter content actually retained its structure even when it was submerged in water. So this is what we call the slake demonstration. So when a soil slakes, it actually starts to fall apart. And that's where we see in that jar on the left, on the right photo, where the soil just literally falls apart. And the reason why this happens is it's because the presence of glue-like compounds like the mycorrhizal fungi and the bacteria produce. So where we have the high organic matter soil, we have a greater food source for soil biology. And the more greater food source we have for soil biology, guess what? We're going to support more soil life. And that soil life, as we've been talking about, they create these glues that take these micro aggregates and form them into macro aggregates, so that when they are exposed to water, they actually stay held together, because that glomalin is like a cementing agent, a glue-like compound that keeps those aggregates together. So it's not just, you know, forming macro aggregates that's important, but it's the stability of those aggregates to resist degradation by water. So dead plant residues, for the most part, aren't going to keep the soil aggregates together, but again, they're part of the food source, as well as what the sugars that are being released by plant roots That's the food source to help drive the soil biology to create these glues to form these aggregates. Next slide, please. So here's aggregate stability in action in a rainfall simulator demonstration. I've had an opportunity to run these things dozens of times in several states on cropland and on pasture. And every time I do it, it's just amazing what I see. And in fact, a lot of people are oftentimes they're looking at it in complete disbelief because they're wondering why things work the way that they work. But in this case, this is a full-scale simulator which has all pasture samples. All 5 trays are pasture samples. And underneath each tray has holes drilled into it so that once you get the sample in the tray, any water that goes through the soil, through the sample, can hit that hole and then go into an infiltration jug that's mounted directly underneath to capture what actually infiltrates through. And then you can see that there are like these funnels on the front of each sample that if any water starts to run off, it catches that runoff and directs it to a jug that's mounted on the very front end of the rainfall simulator. So this is a great demonstration to see, how pastures under different types of management fare when a rain event comes. So the 2 trays on the far right have been overgrazed. There are 2 different grasses, 2 different species of grasses, but look at what's happening. Where they have been overgrazed, the runoff is super, super high. So most of the water is not going in, most of it is actually coming off. So infiltration is very low. And if the soil aggregates on the surface of those overgrazed pieces have been stable, there'd be a lot more water going into the trays and far less coming off. And then notice it's not just water that's running off, right, folks? Look at the color of those jugs. We've got soil that's coming off because we don't have good aggregate stability on the soil surface. And if you don't have good aggregate stability on the soil surface, it's kind of like nothing else matters. Because what happens is when that raindrop hits or that irrigation droplet hits any bare ground, then it will then cause those surface aggregates, those surface soil particles to come up out of the air and then redeposit back down on the soil surface. And guess what they're doing is they're plugging up any remaining pores that are on that soil surface, such that water just has a really, really hard time being able to get in. So when that rain event comes, it essentially almost seals off the soil surface, and you're not allowing water to get in, but you're not allowing oxygen to get in either. So a lot of times people think that this demonstration, the runoff and the infiltration, is completely governed by the amount of vegetation covering the soil surface. But if you remember the previous slide with the glass jars, with the 2 types of soils, the low and the high organic matter soil, was there any residue covering either one of those jars? There wasn't. It was just the bare soil. And so when we look at the main driver behind whether a soil is going to infiltrate water, the primary driver would be surface soil aggregation. Secondarily would be cover. Cover is going to make an impact, but it's really that aggregate stability that's making the greatest contribution on whether the pasture is going to receive water or repel it. And then we look at the 3 trays on the left. Those ones are obviously, taking in water. There's virtually no runoff. And if you can see the infiltration jugs underneath, they're getting fairly full. And the color of that water is also clear. Next slide, please. So you might wonder why I'm focusing so much on how soil aggregates are formed. It's really all about creating resiliency, folks, from the climatic extremes that we're seeing more and more of these days. Whether we're talking about droughts or floods, creating stable soil aggregates reduces the severity of both types of catastrophic events. Next slide, please. So when we look at the water cycle here, and I realize we're kind of running low on time, to tell you the truth, folks, I'm having so much fun just getting to talk about this with all of you and with Lee. Time is just getting away from me. But that's how it is when you're talking about something that you're passionate about. The time just goes by very, very quickly. Here's just a a diagram showing the water cycle. And what I really want to key you in on is where I have those red circles. For our discussion today, a key part of the water cycle is how water is entering the soil. So it's where it's infiltrating at, and then the other circle is that water is infiltrating so that plants can take it up for their own growth, for their own maintenance. And again, soil aggregation. If we don't have good soil surface aggregation, if we have a lot of overgrazing occurring where pastures are grazed down pretty short, pretty tight for long periods of time, we're not going to have that surface soil aggregation. And then essentially we kind of create a pasture that's hydrophobic, meaning that it doesn't like water. It actually repels and sheds water rather than taking it in. So what we want to be able to do is as we enhance soil aggregation, our water cycle, our hydrologic cycle starts working more and more efficiently so that our plants can continue growing longer and longer between rain events. Next slide, please. So this graph here, just very quickly, it represents our understanding of how pastures generally respond after a major disturbance or catastrophe. And this is where, we're getting into that concept of resiliency. The green line represents a pasture that's in a higher state of health. The red line represents a pasture that's in a lower state of health. So a pasture that is very resilient, like you see the one in the high state of health, if we have a catastrophic event happen, like a severe drought or like a flood event, it does drop in health and productivity somewhat, but guess what? It tends to bounce back a lot faster because we've got greater soil aggregation, more stable soil aggregates that are built into that system compared to a pasture that's in a much lower state of health, where when we get that catastrophic event, guess what? The floor just drops from underneath of you, and then it takes forever for that pasture to recover. And so really, again, the focus on soil aggregation and soil health, the reason why that's so important is because we need resiliency. And boy, there's no better time in the world's history that we need resiliency in our pasture ecosystems than we do now. Next slide, please. So grazing management is a tool to capture energy by plants, to harvest that energy by animals, to convert it into energy, into a marketable product. And that grazing management is really just a tool to balance all that, right? That's what we're trying to juggle here. Next slide, please. So grazing management should do a lot of these different things for us. So when we're looking at grazing systems, we need to be looking at, how can this accelerate the improvement of my vegetation? Can it facilitate the proper use of forage in all fields? Can it improve the efficiency of grazing through the uniform use of all fields? Can it stabilize the supply of forage throughout the grazing season? We also need our management to enhance the forage quality that's going to meet the needs of livestock and wildlife, as well as improve the functioning of those ecological processes like water and nutrient cycles. And we needed to improve the soil health through the creation of stable soil aggregates. Next slide, please. So when we start talking about different kinds of grazing systems out there, I don't know about you, but a lot of times I almost get dizzy because you hear so many different terms being bounced around that sometimes it can be kind of confusing to keep them all straight. So I created this little diagram here to kind of show where many of the popular grazing systems stack up to each other on two different dimensions. grazing duration on the vertical axis and grazing frequency on the horizontal axis. So at one extreme, we have continuous grazing. So continuous grazing is where the animals are staying in the same spot for months and months on end. So they can come back and rebite the same plant every 5, 7, 10 days, over and over and over and over again. So where continuous grazing, you look at where it fits on the chart, the grazing duration is very long, the grazing frequency is very high because animals can keep coming back and revisiting the same plant over and over again. There's no restriction on them. But then as we move down towards a lower grazing frequency and a shorter grazing duration, we start getting into more of the management intensive style type grazing systems, such as management intensive grazing or mid grazing, the short duration grazing. And then on the very extreme end, we've got ultra high stock density grazing where people are moving like 5 to 10 times a day on very, very small paddocks. So you have this gradation of extremes on both ends where the grazing duration, the grazing frequency is being changed. And so this is where, what we have to look at is, what type of grazing system is going to help meet our goals. And let's go to the next slide, please. I'm almost done. So when we look at stock density on the vertical axis and grazing duration on the horizontal axis, we find that essentially, your ultra high stock density grazing, your high stock density grazing, mob grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, plant grazing, cell grazing, these types of grazing systems really focus on a shorter grazing duration and higher stock density combined with a longer recovery period. And so when we ask the question, which one's going to improve soil health, probably the quickest, next slide, please. That is where we're kind of looking in this upper right-hand corner of that graph is these more management intensive systems allow us to optimize the utilization of those plants so that those plants can fully recover from the prior grazing event or catastrophic event, while also trying to optimize animal nutrition at the same time. So it's kind of ironic, the continuous grazing on one end, which really requires no management at all. You're not going to move the needle on soil health and soil aggregation. You're going to actually go in reverse. And that requires the least amount of intervention. Just turn the animals out, let them do their thing. But on the opposite end, where it requires very, very high level of management, there is tremendous rewards in actually being able to build soil aggregation over time so that we can create more resiliency within our pasture ecosystems. So we'll get more into this on the effects on plants in our next session on May 12th. So stay tuned for that. And next slide, please. And for that, here are a few resources for you to access. We've got a variety of publications, blogs, videos, and podcasts. There's also the soilforwater.org website, which you can become a member of and be able to have an opportunity to collaborate ideas on how to improve turning your soil more into a sponge and creating that and being able to be part of a network, a community of individuals. I'm on it, Lee's on it, many NCAT staff are on it. And then we also have a resource list which will be sent out tomorrow by email to all of you that registered for this. So again, thank you all for attending. Sorry for, it looks like I'm about a minute over here, but Carlos, do we want to go ahead and begin the evaluation right now?
Yes, I'll bring that right up.
Thanks, Justin. I appreciate it. That's so much to digest, and I love how you break it down and present it. And I think we had some really good questions. I really appreciate working with you, brother. This is awesome.
Likewise.
Yeah, we hope participants that you would take the time to just quickly answer this session evaluation. I know you guys do this a lot for sessions you go to, and we like to get this because it helps to make sure that we're on track and doing what we think we're doing, and maybe make it better for next time. So we really appreciate your feedback. Let's see if we got some more chats and such.
Yeah, and go ahead, go to that next slide there, Carlos. When people get done with the session evaluation, then if there's any questions or whatever, we'll be happy to entertain those for a few minutes at least.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we'll stick around if needed. I know people have stuff to do. We've kept you for an hour and a half, and please, if you got kids to take care of or dinner or whatever, you know, that's fine. I get it. But if you have any other little questions, certainly don't mind sticking around for a few minutes. So, Carlos, what happens? Do you get a percentage here of like who's like how many people have? How do we know when we're done with the evaluation?
Yes, we're getting there. We're at over 80%.
Okay, very cool. You guys are awesome. Thank you for responding with the evaluation. Really appreciate it, and appreciate you being here too. Certainly, the next session on May 12th at 5 Central, 6 Eastern, we'll be going into plants, right? Justin, that's the one on plants?
Oh yeah, all about plants.
All about plants. There you go. So we're going to dig deep into plants, and then the next one, after that, 2 weeks later, will be on animals. We'll talk about animals, animal nutrition. I believe, I don't know if that, yeah. All of my projects are running together, Justin, so it's hard to keep everything in line. But then finally, the fourth one we're going to do on June 9th will be bringing it all together with adaptive management and monitoring, and some really fascinating stuff on grazing systems, really breaking that down on animal movements and such. So we hope that you will hope that you will participate in those and tell your friends as well. These are free, and we'd like to have more people to participate. So Robbie says, if we register for this session, are we automatically enrolled for the rest of the sessions? Yes, the answer is yes. You should have an email that will get to you to everyone. Okay, so check your upcoming emails. You'll be getting an email, before the session. So thank you for that. Okay, hey, so I hope you can explain oxidation more and why it's negative. Claire asks. Justin, would you like to answer that question?
Yes, absolutely. So oxidation, if you see vegetation that hasn't been grazed, like vegetation that sits above the soil surface, not contacting the soil surface, if it doesn't break down, it goes from like a brown to a gray. So that's where we say, well, this vegetation is oxidizing. And what that means is that most of the carbon that's being released from that plant is going back up as CO2, and it's not getting incorporated into the soil. So most of our soils are very carbon depleted. We need more carbon in our soils. We don't need any more of it in our atmosphere. And that's where, in situations where grazing is being completely excluded, we'll oftentimes see where that vegetation, it starts to lay down, and then eventually over a period of about, as it weathers there, it starts to turn gray, and most of the carbon that's tied up in that material actually gets released as CO2. And instead of being earthworm food, that can then actually, be part of the nutrient cycle in the soil profile.
Cool. All right. So another one, Kevin writes, will soil aggregation negate the need for tilling?
Will soil aggregation negate the need for tilling?
Yeah.
Good question. So they're really kind of two totally different things. You know, tillage will destroy soil aggregation. Flat out, it just does. I mean, if you take soil and you put it in your blender, what does it do? It takes everything down to much, much smaller particles. So if you're in an organic system and you are using tillage to terminate something, what I suggest is that we look for ways to minimize the amount of tillage that is being done. And there's different, you know, you can't put all tillage in the same box. You know, a plow does things differently than a disc harrow, differently than a chisel plow. And so there are some forms of tillage that are less invasive and less harsh on macro aggregates. I can think of at least a couple examples of those. Some people have modified rototillers to run at very reduced speeds so that they're not going through and acting like a blender and smashing up their macro aggregates. They'll actually gear down the rototiller and up their travel speed so that they're just cutting through roots to just terminate what's there, but not spending so much time going so slow at a high rate of PTO speed, really smashing those macro aggregates down. So you can modify like a rototiller or rotavator to do that. There's also implements that come over from Europe that actually are called soil spaders, a spader device. And what it actually does is it rotates very slowly. And it's kind of like you going out with the shovel and just kind of spading your ground more gently. So there are some forms of tillage that are less destructive to soil aggregates. And that's where I encourage people to look at those options rather than, running a disc like a disc harrow, extremely destructive. And the more times you run over the same piece of ground with it, the more destructive it is, because it's not only smashing macro aggregates, but it's also creating a plow pan, creating compaction, because that disc is actually putting a fair amount of weight right on the soil that's directly underneath of it. So again, seek for ways that you can reduce the amount of tillage or change the type of tillage that you're doing so that you preserve your macro aggregate structure as much as possible.
Okay, thanks. That was great. I may have misread or it was misspelled or either one, I don't know, but he's really, I think, interested in tile and terraces. But I'm glad that you gave us that. That was exactly what I was thinking. I'm not sure that tiles and terraces would do anything to negate soil aggregation, except in the immediate construction zone, right? Do you have any thoughts on that, Justin?
Well, I was just going to say, tiling, the reason why we tile is because essentially the soil function, a lot of the soil function has been lost. So if we have well aggregated soils, if we're not farming in a swamp, if we're not farming in an area that shouldn't be having a lot of water in it in the first place, if we have good aggregate stability, good structure, that soil should be a sponge and it should absorb water and not be a situation where we're trying to get rid of water.
Cool. So Roger asks, bindweed outcompetes desirable solutions. And then Roby says sheep love bindweed, and that's true. So there is a cultural way of taking care of certain weeds and like bindweed through grazing for sure, using proper species. Also, high density grazing for short duration, for short periods of time, can really alter the composition of pastures, right?
Yeah.
that bindweed is there for a reason. All those plants are there for a reason, soaking up nutrients because it either had a competitive edge or there's a certain mineral deficiency within the soil profile. There's certain soil characteristics, but after that soil comes to life, you'll get a flush over the next few years of a population that will probably surprise you. And bindweed it may not completely disappear, but it would become a part of a very diverse pasture where it is doing its job, right? So I would say, yeah, you've got the cultural method of using sheep to graze that, and high density grazing and putting a lot of animals on for a short period of time and just putting that stuff into the ground, putting all that carbon right back down and then giving it a good long rest can do worlds for all kinds of problems we see with plant communities.
And bindweed probably has a pretty good nutritional profile to it.
I would think
because
so.
It has roots that go down 25 feet from some of the stuff I've read.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah. So you're pulling up. I mean, it's doing its job. It's there for a reason. Karen says, will you be covering spreading of compost in pastures? And I was kind of looking through our agenda for the next several weeks. And while it is not a major topic that I think we'll be covering, since you mentioned it, I think it's something I think we should definitely speak about those types of inputs, right? Because some dairy farmers and such need to get rid of manure from the parlor, right? From the alleyways. And so you're spreading manure. Some people want to use compost and things in order to add organic matter to the soil. And that's an excellent way to increase organic content. So I think we're going to look for ways to talk about those types of inputs. So thank you for that, Karen. And Karen also says, will you be covering what to do about jumping worms? I don't know what to do about jumping worms. I
don't know anything about them.
Oh my gosh, but it's scary because I mean, on my plot, I'm just wondering now, because I'm going to be, doing a lot of planting here. We're finally in Northeast Pennsylvania getting ready that I can do some planting soon. And I'm just dreading it to go up and dig and start looking and identifying, what do I have? Do I got jumpers or do I got native worms? So I don't want to push your question aside, Karen, but certainly I don't know what to do, and I don't know that many people do. But again, thank you for the question, because it definitely puts it in our minds. So Walter Davis says he heard biochar helps with jumping worms. And Linda Coffey says, what are jumping worms? Well, they're an invasive worm, and they flick around and they jump, and they have very distinctive characteristics on the little that little circle on their body. It's more red in color, and they're very invasive, and they will take over a plot of land and kind of depopulate native worms. And they're not as effective as with nutrient cycling as our natives are, from what I understand. So with that, you guys just got the breadth of my knowledge on jumping worms. I'm scared of them. I don't want them. I hope they're not there. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so we have gone 5 minutes over. If there's no more questions or comments, I want to say thank you so much to Linda Poole and to Linda Coffey and to Tracy Muma, our NCAT specialists who have been monitoring the chat, and they've been answering some questions. Those guys, I work with those guys all the time. Linda runs our livestock team, and we all work together as a team. And Linda Poole is out in Montana, and Tracy's in Montana as well. And they're fascinating and are able to answer a lot of your questions and that you may have. They're great people to interact with on issues regarding livestock and pasture and agriculture. So, so thank you to them, and thank you so much to Carlos for running our show and making sure that the polls get done and the evaluations get done, and making sure that we that we had the registration and that you could come. And thank you, Justin, for everything that you've done to make this happen as well. Look forward to the next 3 sessions.
Yes. Yes.
And,
Thank you. Thank you, Lee.
Yeah, very cool. We'll do this again on May 12th. Is that right?
Yep. May 12th.
Okay. All right, folks. Really appreciate it. Thanks for hanging with us. And we're going to send out an email to everybody with a resource list tomorrow. So good night. As for me, it's time for dinner.